All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about the Spanish crown, but this isn't your typical fairy tale. It's more like a thousand-year-old shadow, one that actually stretches right into the heart of modern-day Spain. You know, when you think about European royalty, your mind probably goes straight to the fairy tale stuff, right? Grand weddings, sparkling palaces. But the story of Spain's crown? Whoa, it's something else entirely. It's this long, dark shadow, a really complicated and sometimes brutal history that has literally shaped some of the country's biggest conflicts. So, where does a story like this even begin? Well, it all kicks off with the creation of a really powerful, and as we're about to find out, a pretty dangerous myth. Okay, so get this. Right from the very beginning, there's this theme of outsiders. The first rulers of the land that would eventually become Spain, they weren't even from there. They were Germanic Visigoths. And we're talking about a tiny elite group trying to rule over a huge local population. So how do you pull that off? You lean hard on religion, and you create some epic, heroic myths to make it seem like you're supposed to be in charge. Okay, so the official story you often hear about Spain kind of skips over the messy beginning. It wasn't some unified Spanish kingdom from day one. It actually started with the total collapse of a Visigothic kingdom. That was followed by nearly 800 years of Islamic rule in a place called Al-Andalus. And the so-called Reconquista, that wasn't some noble unified crusade. It was a brutal, centuries-long free-for-all for power. This whole idea of a glorious ancient Catholic kingdom, it was pretty much invented after the fact. Real unification, though, that didn't happen for a long time. It wasn't until the famous Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, came along, and wow, did they ever leave their mark. During their reign, they basically set the course for Spain for centuries to come. They finished the Reconquista, they kicked out all non-Catholics, they launched a massive global empire, and they tied it all together with this incredibly potent idea of purity of blood. And to represent this new vision, this vision of unity through force, they chose these two symbols for themselves, the yoke and the arrows. Now, I know they look like something out of a history book, just some old symbols, but trust me, their legacy is shockingly powerful, and it lasts for a long time. And here's the payoff. You want to know how powerful that legacy is? Fast forward hundreds of years, the exact same royal symbols pop up again. This time, they're the central image for Spain's fascist party and plastered right on the national shields under the dictator, Franco. That old myth? Yeah, it was still working its magic. So after that powerful myth-making start, guess what happens? The crown ends up in foreign hands all over again. And this kicks off a whole new era, but not one of stability. Oh no. This one's all about chaos, decay, and even civil war. So the German Habsburgs arrive and take the throne. But they had this obsession. They were determined to keep power locked inside the family. And their method? Constant inbreeding. And this led to an absolute biological catastrophe that would literally bring their whole dynasty crashing down. The tragic endpoint of all this was King Charles II. His nickname was the Bewitched. And honestly, it fits. He was so incredibly sick from generations of inbreeding that he was physically unable to have an heir. When he died, it wasn't just a Spanish problem. It sparked a massive Europe-wide war over who was going to take over the Spanish throne. And the winner of that war? Yep, another foreign dynasty. This time, the French Bourbons. You'd think things would calm down, but no. Their time in charge was just as chaotic. We're talking about the king betraying Spain's very first constitution, huge scandals about whether heirs were even legitimate. And it all ends with King Alfonso XIII being forced into exile when the Second Republic rises up in 1931. All right, so this is where the story takes a really weird turn. This brings us to what has to be one of the strangest political partnerships of the entire 20th century. The bizarre alliance between Spanish fascism and the monarchy. And you've got to ask yourself, right, why? I mean, think about it. Fascist movements like in Italy and Germany were all about revolution. They hated the old monarchies and aristocrats. So what made the Spanish fascists so different? Well, It turns out the Spanish version was what you'd call a rara avis, a real rare bird. Their support for the king? It was totally opportunistic. See, they weren't forward-looking revolutionaries. Instead, they were completely obsessed with the imperial glory of Spain's past. And get this, for a wild idea, they actually proposed a marriage between their leader's sister and Adolf Hitler. The goal? To create a brand new Nazi Spanish royal dynasty. Just wow. So, when the dictator Franco finally seizes power, he looks at the royal line and decides, no, I don't trust the actual heir. So what does he do? He completely bypasses him, skips a whole generation, and handpicks the young prince Juan Carlos to be his chosen successor. He then spends years grooming him, all to make sure his own authoritarian regime would continue after he was gone. And that brings us right up to the modern day. This is where we see how this long, twisted history continues to haunt not just the Spanish crown, but the entire country. King Juan Carlos ended up being, just one of the most contradictory figures you can imagine. To the old fascists, he was a total traitor for bringing in democracy. But to the leftists, he was a fascist himself, chosen by Franco. For millions, he was the hero who saved Spain. And now, today, he's seen by pretty much everyone as a symbol of deep systemic corruption. How can one person be all those things? And that heroic narrative, it held up for decades. It really did. But here's the kicker. It turns out his massive financial scandals weren't some big shock to everybody. Apparently, they were an open secret among the Spanish elite, who were more than happy to help keep that hero of democracy myth alive. So, okay, after 1,000 years of all this drama, all this history, why should we care? Why does any of this matter right now, today? Well, because it's not just history. It has very real, very tangible consequences for people living in Spain. And look, this isn't just some vague feeling or a historical anecdote. This is something you can actually measure. If you look at the data, the OECD shows that Spain has one of the highest levels of wealth inequality in all of Western Europe. And a big reason for that is that these old structures from the past, things like massive landholdings by aristocrats, they never really went away. They're still there. And what all this does is it places the monarchy right at the very heart of a deep modern-day division in the country. For its supporters, the crown is what guarantees stability. It's the keeper of the status quo. But for its critics, they see it as the absolute peak of an unequal society, one that's built on a foundation of corruption and ancient privilege. So this whole explainer really leaves us with one last, kind of haunting question. The Spanish crown, it's so much more than just a tradition. It's a powerful story of how a nation's foundational myths can echo through time, shaping its reality for 1,000 years. And it really makes you wonder, if a nation's history is its ghost, how does a country ever truly lay it to rest?